The morning mist clung to the waters of Pearl Harbor like a shroud, masking the greatest intelligence catastrophe in American military history. As the sun prepared to rise on December 7, 1941, Admiral Husband Edward Kimmel stood on the deck of his flagship, unaware that 6 aircraft carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy were cutting through Pacific swells just 200 miles north of Oahu. The rising sun flag fluttered ominously above. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida's lead aircraft as 353 Japanese planes prepared for what would become one of the most devastating surprise attacks in naval warfare. The roots of this catastrophe stretched back months, woven through a tapestry of arrogance, miscommunication, and fatal underestimation. In Washington, decrypt specialists worked feverishly in a classified program known as MAGIC, intercepting and translating Japanese diplomatic messages. Purple machines clicked and whirred as cryptographers decoded Tokyo's communications. Yet, the intelligence community remained fractured, jealously guarding secrets between Army and Navy divisions like medieval fiefdoms protecting their treasures. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, Admiral Chester Nimitz's intelligence officer, had been tracking Japanese fleet movements with growing concern throughout the autumn of 1941. Radio intercepts suggested unusual naval activity, but the Japanese had implemented radio silence protocols that created an information vacuum. Where once American listening posts could track the Imperial Navy's movements through their communications chatter, now there was only silence. A silence that should have screamed warnings across the Pacific. According to declassified documents from the National Security Agency archives, this communication blackout was one of the most significant warning signs that American intelligence officials failed to properly interpret. General Walter Short, commanding Army forces in Hawaii, received a war warning from Washington on November 27th. But the message was ambiguous, focusing on sabotage threats rather than aerial assault. Short interpreted this as a directive to protect aircraft from local saboteurs, ordering planes parked wingtip to wingtip, a formation that would prove catastrophically vulnerable to air attack. Meanwhile, Admiral Kimmel received his own warning, equally vague, advising him to take defensive measures but providing no specific intelligence about imminent threats. The bureaucratic maze of American intelligence had created a perfect storm of ignorance. Army intelligence officers refused to share crucial intercepts with their Navy counterparts, while Navy cryptographers hoarded their discoveries like precious gems. In this atmosphere of institutional paranoia, vital pieces of the puzzle remained scattered across different desks, never assembled into the complete picture that might have saved thousands of lives. Captain Wilfred Holmes, working in the basement of the 14th Naval District Headquarters, spent sleepless nights analyzing Japanese radio patterns. His charts showed disturbing gaps in communications from Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's 1st Air Fleet, but his superiors dismissed these concerns as routine operational security. The Japanese had successfully convinced American analysts that their missing carriers were conducting training exercises in home waters, when in reality, Nagumo's strike force was already steaming toward their date with infamy. As Saturday night, December 6th, settled over the Hawaiian Islands, American servicemen enjoyed their weekend liberty, unaware that Japanese submarines were already positioning themselves outside Pearl Harbor. The USS Ward, patrolling the harbor entrance, would encounter these underwater intruders in just hours, firing the first shots of America's Pacific War in darkness and confusion. But even this initial contact would fail to trigger the massive, defensive response that might have blunted the coming aerial onslaught. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, his weathered face reflecting decades of naval service as he gazed across the strike force that represented Japan's most audacious military gamble. The Kido Butai, comprising 6 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, along with their escort of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, had maintained radio silence for 12 days while crossing 3,000 miles of Pacific Ocean. Emperor Hirohito's decision to authorize this attack had set in motion events that would reshape the global balance of power, yet American intelligence remained blind to the approaching tempest. The Japanese plan, conceived by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, represented a masterpiece of strategic deception and operational planning. Yamamoto understood that Japan's industrial capacity could never match America's in a prolonged conflict, making a decisive first strike essential. His target selection proved brilliant in its simplicity: cripple the American Pacific Fleet in a single devastating blow, buying Japan precious months to consolidate conquests across Southeast Asia and the Central Pacific before America could respond effectively. Commander Minoru Genda, the tactical architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had spent months studying American naval routines, analyzing reconnaissance photographs, and perfecting attack formations. His intelligence indicated that American battleships typically moored in pairs along the southeast shore of Ford Island on weekends, presenting perfect targets for both torpedo bombers and high-level bombardment. The shallow waters of Pearl Harbor, only 40 feet deep in many areas, had seemed to offer protection against torpedo attacks. But Japanese engineers had modified their aerial torpedoes with wooden fins and shallow running capabilities specifically to overcome this obstacle. Back in Washington, the final diplomatic exchanges between Secretary of State Cordell Hull and Japanese Ambassador Kichisaburo Nomura created a false sense that negotiations might still prevent war. Hull's November 26th note, demanding Japanese withdrawal from China and French Indochina, had essentially ended any possibility of diplomatic resolution. Yet American officials clung to hopes that Tokyo might accept these terms rather than risk confrontation with the United States. This diplomatic theater provided perfect cover for Nagumo's approaching fleet, as American attention remained focused on Southeast Asia rather than Hawaii. The intelligence community's failure extended beyond simple communication breakdowns to fundamental analytical errors. Colonel Rufus Bratton, chief of the Army's Far East Section, had access to decrypted Japanese messages indicating diplomatic relations would be severed on December 7th, but he failed to connect this deadline with the possibility of immediate military action. Similarly, Navy intelligence officers noted increased Japanese diplomatic activity worldwide, but interpreted this as preparation for attacks on British and Dutch possessions rather than American territory. Historical analysis conducted by military historians at the Naval War College has identified these analytical blind spots as symptomatic of a broader institutional failure to adapt intelligence methods to modern warfare's rapid pace. Captain Joseph Rochefort, stationed at Station Hypo in Hawaii, represented one of the Pacific Fleet's most capable intelligence officers, yet even his expertise proved insufficient against Japanese operational security. Rochefort's team had achieved remarkable success in breaking Japanese naval codes during peacetime, but Tokyo's implementation of new cipher systems and communication protocols in late 1941 created intelligence gaps at the worst possible moment. The Japanese Navy's JN-25 code, used for operational communications, remained largely unreadable to American cryptographers in December 1941. Lieutenant Commander Layton continued pressing his superiors about the missing Japanese carriers, but Admiral Kimmel's staff remained convinced that these vessels posed no immediate threat to Hawaii. The prevailing wisdom held that Japanese strategic attention focused entirely on Southeast Asian objectives, making an attack on American territory militarily illogical. This strategic myopia reflected broader American assumptions about Japanese capabilities and intentions, assumptions that would prove catastrophically wrong within hours. As December 6th dawned across the Pacific, final preparations accelerated. Aboard Nagumo's carriers, maintenance crews armed torpedoes and bombs while pilots received final briefings on their targets. The element of surprise remained complete, with American radio intercepts showing no indication that Pearl Harbor's defenders suspected anything beyond routine weekend training exercises. The stage was set for one of history's most devastating intelligence failures. Dawn broke over the Opana radar station on December 7th, with Private George Elliott and Private Joseph Lockard completing their final hour of watch duty. At 7:02 in the morning, their SCR-270 radar detected a massive formation of aircraft approaching from the north at 132 miles distance. Elliott, inexperienced but alert, immediately recognized the significance of such a large aerial formation. But when they contacted the information center at Fort Shafter, Lieutenant Kermit Tyler dismissed their report with fatal casualness, assuming the contacts represented expected B-17 Flying Fortresses arriving from California. This single moment of misinterpretation represented the culmination of months of intelligence failures, communication breakdowns, and institutional complacency. Tyler's decision to disregard the radar warning stemmed from a broader pattern of assumptions that had infected American military thinking throughout 1941. The prevailing belief that Japan would never risk attacking American territory while simultaneously engaging British and Dutch forces in Southeast Asia had created a dangerous blind spot in strategic planning. Admiral Kimmel's intelligence briefings throughout late November and early December consistently emphasized threats to the Philippines, Guam, and Wake Island, while virtually ignoring the possibility of attacks on Hawaiian installations. Captain Layton's growing concerns about missing Japanese carriers were repeatedly dismissed by staff officers who remained convinced that Admiral Nagumo's First Air Fleet was conducting routine training exercises in Japanese home waters. This institutional groupthink prevented proper analysis of accumulating intelligence indicators that should have triggered maximum alert status. The Magic Intercepts, America's most valuable intelligence source, had provided tantalizing glimpses of Japanese intentions without revealing operational details. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo's instructions to Ambassador Nomura contained clear references to a deadline of December 7th for diplomatic negotiations, but American analysts failed to grasp the military significance of this specific date. The 14-part message, intercepted and partially decoded on December 6th, indicated that diplomatic relations would be severed, yet no one connected this development with the possibility of immediate military action against American territories. According to testimony before the Congressional Pearl Harbor Investigation Committee, this analytical failure reflected systemic problems within the American intelligence community that persisted well into World War II. Colonel Bratton spent the early morning hours of December 7th attempting to locate General George Marshall to deliver the final magic decrypt, but the Army Chief of Staff was on his usual Sunday morning horseback ride. When Marshall finally received the message at 11:25, he insisted on sending a warning telegram to Hawaii rather than using secure telephone communications, concerned about maintaining the secrecy of America's code-breaking capabilities. This telegram would arrive at RCA's Honolulu office just as Japanese bombs began falling on Pearl Harbor. The USS Ward's encounter with a Japanese midget submarine at 6:45 provided another missed opportunity for adequate warning. Lieutenant William Outerbridge's report of sinking an unidentified submarine in the defensive sea area should have triggered immediate alert procedures, but the chain of command moved with peacetime lethargy. By the time Admiral Kimmel received word of this incident, Fuchida's first wave was already approaching Pearl Harbor's entrance channel. Communication failures plagued every level of the American defense structure. Army and Navy intelligence officers maintained separate analytical staffs that rarely shared information, creating artificial barriers to comprehensive threat assessment. General Short's interpretation of Washington's war warning as a sabotage alert led him to position aircraft for protection against ground attack rather than dispersal for combat operations. Meanwhile, Admiral Kimmel's focus on training exercises and routine maintenance left his fleet concentrated and vulnerable. The Japanese had achieved tactical and strategic surprise through a combination of operational security, deception, and American institutional failures. Radio silence maintained by Nagumo's task force eliminated the primary intelligence source that American analysts had relied upon for tracking Japanese naval movements. Simultaneously, continued diplomatic negotiations in Washington created the impression that Japan sought to avoid immediate confrontation with the United States. As 7:48 approached, Commander Fuchida observed Pearl Harbor spread below his formation like a detailed model, with 8 battleships moored along Battleship Row and dozens of other vessels anchored throughout the harbor. The complete absence of defensive fighter patrols confirmed that surprise had been achieved beyond Japanese expectations, setting the stage for one of the most devastating naval attacks in military history. At 7:48 on the morning of December 7, 1941, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida keyed his radio transmitter and broadcast the code words "Tora, Tora, Tora" across the Pacific, informing Admiral Nagumo that complete tactical surprise had been achieved. Below his lead aircraft, Pearl Harbor lay peaceful and unprepared, its massive naval installations gleaming in the early morning sunlight like targets on a practice range. the sight that greeted Fuchida's first wave of 183 aircraft exceeded even Japanese expectations. 8 battleships moored in perfect formation along the southeast shore of Ford Island, with dozens of cruisers, destroyers, and auxiliary vessels anchored throughout the harbor. The attack unfolded. With devastating precision, each aircraft group executing predetermined assignments with clockwork efficiency. Lieutenant Commander Shigeharu Murata led his torpedo bombers in low-level approaches against Battleship Row, their specially modified aerial torpedoes cutting through Pearl Harbor's shallow waters to strike the massive warships below their armor belts. Simultaneously, high-level bombers under Lieutenant Commander Kakuichi Takahashi released their modified 16-inch naval shells, converted to aerial bombs specifically for this mission, while dive bombers targeted smaller vessels and shore installations with deadly accuracy. The USS Oklahoma, moored outboard of the USS Maryland, absorbed 5 torpedo hits within the first 10 minutes of the attack, capsizing so rapidly that 429 sailors trapped below decks never had a chance to escape. Captain Howard Bode, commanding the USS Oklahoma, died with his ship as she rolled over, taking with her decades of naval tradition and hundreds of American lives. The USS West Virginia, struck by 7 torpedoes and 2 bombs, settled slowly into the harbor mud while her crew fought desperately to maintain power and abandon ship in good order. Admiral Kimmel watched the destruction from his headquarters window, his face reflecting the horror of seeing his Pacific Fleet systematically destroyed, while he remained powerless to respond effectively. The careful defensive plans developed over months of peacetime preparation proved worthless against an enemy who had achieved complete strategic and tactical surprise. Anti-aircraft guns remained unmanned, ammunition lockers stayed locked, and fighter aircraft sat wingtip to wingtip on airfields throughout Oahu, presenting perfect targets for Japanese strafing attacks. Contemporary accounts from survivors, documented in the Pearl Harbor History Associates archives, describe the attack's opening minutes as resembling a training exercise gone wrong rather than actual combat. The USS Arizona's destruction at 8:06 became the attack's most devastating single moment. A converted 16-inch shell, dropped from 10,000 feet by a high-level bomber, penetrated the battleship's forward magazine, detonating over 1 million pounds of black powder in a catastrophic explosion that killed 1,177 sailors and Marines instantly. The blast lifted Arizona's forward turrets completely off their foundations, sending debris thousands of feet into the air, while a massive fireball consumed the ship's superstructure. Lieutenant Commander Logan Ramsey, duty officer at Ford Island's Command Center, transmitted the first official alert at 7:58. Air raid Pearl Harbor X. This is not drill. This message, repeated across military communication networks throughout the Pacific, marked America's entry into World War II, but it came too late to prevent the destruction already underway. By the time American defensive systems began responding, Japanese aircraft had achieved their primary objectives against the battle line. Fighter pilots at Wheeler Field and Hickam Field attempted desperate responses despite having their aircraft destroyed on the ground. Second Lieutenant George Welch and Second Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor managed to reach Halewa Field, where 2 P-40 Warhawks had escaped the initial strafing attacks. Their subsequent aerial combat, accounting for several Japanese aircraft, represented one of the few American success stories during the attack's opening phase, but their heroic efforts could not materially affect the outcome. The second wave, led by Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki with 171 aircraft, arrived at 8:54 to complete the destruction of remaining targets. By this time, American anti-aircraft defenses had begun responding effectively, but the damage to Pearl Harbor's major combatant vessels was already complete. 8 battleships had been sunk or severely damaged, along with 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and numerous auxiliary vessels, while shore installations throughout Oahu bore the scars of systematic bombardment. As the last Japanese aircraft disappeared over the northern horizon at 10:05, Pearl Harbor resembled a maritime graveyard. Black smoke rose thousands of feet into the clear Hawaiian sky, while rescue crews began the grim task of searching for survivors among the wreckage of America's Pacific Fleet. The silence that followed the Japanese withdrawal felt more deafening than the thunder of bombs and torpedoes that had preceded it. Pearl Harbor lay shrouded in acrid smoke, its once pristine waters now stained with oil and debris from 18 sunk or damaged warships. Admiral Kimmel walked among the wreckage of his command, surveying destruction that exceeded even the most pessimistic pre-war planning scenarios. The Pacific Fleet's battle line, America's primary symbol of naval power in the Pacific, had been reduced to twisted metal and smoking hulks in less than 2 hours of combat. Casualties mounted as rescue teams worked frantically to extract survivors from capsized vessels and burning installations. The USS Oklahoma's overturned hull became a tomb for 429 sailors, while the USS Arizona continued burning for days, her magazine fires defying all efforts at suppression. Hospital ships and medical facilities throughout Oahu struggled to treat over 1,000 wounded personnel, many suffering from burns, blast injuries, and smoke inhalation that would affect them for the remainder of their lives. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt received word of the attack while having lunch at the White House, his initial reaction reflecting disbelief that Japanese forces could have achieved such complete surprise against American military installations. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox's telephone call at 1:40 confirming the scope of destruction marked a turning point in American strategic thinking, forcing abandonment of pre-war assumptions about Japanese military capabilities and intentions. The intelligence community's failure became apparent within hours, as investigators began reconstructing the timeline of missed opportunities and misinterpreted signals. Colonel Bratton's attempts to deliver the final magic intercept to General Marshall had failed to reach Hawaii before the attack commenced, while Lieutenant Tyler's dismissal of the Opana radar contact represented perhaps the most consequential single decision in American military intelligence history. These individual failures reflected broader institutional problems that would require months of reorganization to address effectively. Analysis conducted by the Army Pearl Harbor Board identified 42 specific instances where better intelligence coordination might have provided adequate warning of the impending attack. General Short faced immediate questions about his decision to maintain sabotage alert rather than full combat readiness, while Admiral Kimmel confronted criticism for concentrating his fleet in Pearl Harbor without adequate defensive preparations. Both commanders had operated within the constraints of intelligence estimates that consistently underestimated Japanese capabilities while overestimating American defensive advantages, but such explanations provided little comfort to grieving families and an outraged nation. The USS Nevada's attempt to get underway during the attack represented American determination to fight back, despite overwhelming odds. Lieutenant Commander Francis Thomas, commanding the battleship in Captain Walter Scanlan's absence, ordered the ship to sortie despite heavy damage from torpedo and bomb hits. Nevada's progress down the main channel, with her crew fighting fires and flooding while maintaining steam, inspired sailors throughout Pearl Harbor, who witnessed her courageous attempt to reach open water. Japanese losses proved remarkably light compared to the destruction they had inflicted. 29 aircraft failed to return to their carriers, while 5 midget submarines were lost during the harbor penetration attempt. Admiral Nagumo's decision to retire without launching a third attack wave, despite recommendations from his staff officers to target Pearl Harbor's fuel storage facilities and repair shops, represented a strategic error that would affect Japanese operations throughout the war's early phases. Captain Mervyn Benion's death aboard the USS West Virginia exemplified the courage displayed by American personnel throughout the attack. Despite mortal wounds from bomb fragments, Benion continued commanding his ship until relieved by Lieutenant Commander Roscoe Hillenkoetter, refusing medical evacuation while his crew fought to save their vessel. His posthumous Medal of Honor recognized leadership that inspired countless others during Pearl Harbor's darkest hour. The attack's strategic consequences extended far beyond Pearl Harbor's immediate destruction. Japan's success in achieving tactical surprise, while maintaining diplomatic negotiations, convinced American leaders that future enemy intentions could not be assessed through traditional diplomatic channels alone. This realization would drive major intelligence reforms and contribute to the creation of centralized analytical capabilities that characterized American intelligence operations throughout World War II. As December 7th drew to a close, Pearl Harbor's defenders prepared for possible follow-up attacks, while beginning the massive salvage operations that would eventually return most damaged vessels to active service. The day that would live in infamy had ended, but its consequences would reshape American military thinking for generations to come. The morning of December 8th dawned over a transformed Pearl Harbor, where the smoke of burning ships had given way to the urgent activity of salvage operations and defensive preparations. Admiral Chester Nimitz, selected to replace Admiral Kimmel as Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, arrived at Pearl Harbor on Christmas Day to assume command of what remained of America's naval forces in the Pacific. His first inspection of the harbor revealed both the magnitude of Japanese success and the resilience of American naval engineering, as salvage crews worked around the clock to refloat and repair damaged vessels. The investigation into Pearl Harbor's intelligence failures began immediately, with multiple boards of inquiry examining every aspect of the December 7th catastrophe. The Roberts Commission, appointed by President Roosevelt and chaired by Supreme Court Justice Owen Roberts, conducted the first major investigation, interviewing hundreds of witnesses and reviewing thousands of documents in an attempt to assign responsibility for the disaster. Their findings, released in January 1942, placed primary blame on Admiral Kimmel and General Short for failing to maintain adequate defensive preparations. However, subsequent investigations revealed the complexity of institutional failures that had contributed to Pearl Harbor's vulnerability. The Army Pearl Harbor Board and the Navy Court of Inquiry, conducting more thorough examinations after the war's conclusion, identified systemic problems within the American intelligence community that extended far beyond individual command decisions. The jealous guarding of information between Army and Navy intelligence services had created artificial barriers to comprehensive threat assessment, while overconfidence in American defensive capabilities had led to dangerous complacency. The Joint Congressional Investigation, completed in 1946, produced over 10 million words of testimony and documentation, establishing it as one of the most comprehensive military investigations in American history. Captain Edwin Layton's post-war analysis of intelligence failures emphasized the danger of analytical assumptions that filtered evidence to support predetermined conclusions. American intelligence officers had convinced themselves that Japanese strategic attention focused exclusively on Southeast Asian objectives, making them blind to the possibility of attacks on American territory. This cognitive bias, reinforced by institutional groupthink, prevented proper evaluation of accumulating warning signs that should have triggered maximum alert status. The technical lessons learned from Pearl Harbor revolutionized American naval operations throughout World War II. The effectiveness of aerial torpedo attacks in shallow water forced redesign of harbor defenses and anchorage procedures, while the vulnerability of aircraft parked in close formation led to fundamental changes in airfield security protocols. More significantly, the attack demonstrated that aircraft carriers represented the dominant naval weapon system, as traditional battleship-centered fleet organization proved inadequate against modern aerial assault. Admiral Nimitz's leadership during the Pacific Fleet's reconstruction demonstrated how military organizations could learn from catastrophic failure. His emphasis on aggressive intelligence gathering, innovative tactical development, and decentralized command authority created the operational framework that would eventually defeat the Japanese Navy in decisive battles at Coral Sea, Midway, and the Philippine Sea. The intelligence reforms implemented under his direction ensured that American forces would never again suffer from the coordination failures that had plagued pre-war operations. The human cost of intelligence failure remained painfully visible throughout Pearl Harbor's reconstruction period. Memorial services for the 2,403 Americans killed on December 7th provided sobering reminders of the price paid for institutional complacency and analytical blindness. The USS Arizona Memorial, eventually constructed over the battleship's submerged hull, became a permanent testament to the dangers of underestimating enemy capabilities while overconfidence in defensive preparations. Commander Fuchida's post-war observations about the attack's success emphasized how completely American assumptions had diverged from Japanese strategic reality. His detailed planning had anticipated significant American defensive responses, but the actual absence of fighter patrols, alert anti-aircraft crews, and dispersed aircraft positioning exceeded even optimistic Japanese expectations. This gap between American self-perception and actual defensive capabilities reflected broader institutional problems that required years of wartime experience to correct. The strategic consequences of Pearl Harbor extended throughout the Pacific, war and beyond, establishing principles of intelligence analysis and inter-service cooperation that would influence American military operations for decades. The attack's demonstration that technological surprise could overcome numerical superiority forced fundamental reassessment of strategic planning assumptions, while the effectiveness of coordinated air-sea operations became the foundation for subsequent Pacific campaigns. As the last salvage operations concluded in 1944, Pearl Harbor had been transformed from a symbol of American vulnerability into a monument to institutional learning and national resilience. The intelligence failures that had enabled December 7th's catastrophe were never repeated on such a scale, as the lessons written in blood and oil ensured that future American military operations would benefit from the bitter knowledge purchased at such terrible cost. The rising sun had achieved its moment of triumph, but in doing so, had awakened a sleeping giant whose response would ultimately seal Japan's defeat.